Namaste. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat. My name is Kamal Madi Shetty, and you are tuned into the season 4 of the Festival of Bharat. We are a platform who believe in having open and frank conversations about Bharat with no holds bar. And today we are going to discuss a very important topic, Jammu and Kashmir. The politics, the governance, the challenges of terrorism, as well as the role played by some external players. And to discuss this, we have a very special guest with us, Aarti Tikku Singh ji. Aarti ji is a well-known Indian journalist who was born in Jammu and Kashmir. She is an alumnus of the University of Jammu and did her master's in international affairs from the Columbia University in the city of New York. Aarti ji has over 18 years of experience in journalism, focusing on international relations and conflicts. She has reported from Jammu and Kashmir for over 7 years, more than 7 years, covering a wide variety of issues. After working with dailies like the Hindustan Times and for the longest time, Times of India, she is now with the Indo-Asian News Service, IANS, New Delhi, as the Foreign and Strategic Affairs Editor. Namaste, Aarti ji, and welcome to the Festival of Bharat.
Namaskar, Kamal. Thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Aarti ji. So I want to begin by talking about probably the most important development since independence in Jammu and Kashmir, which is the Article 370. Now, it has been more than a year since the provisions of the Article 370 were nullified, and it has been more than a year since the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir has come into existence. I want to understand how significant are these developments in the larger sort of scheme of things in the context of Jammu and Kashmir, and how have they changed Jammu and Kashmir?
It's a very important question for your audience. Let me get into a bit of history, even though people find history boring, but I think in the context of Jammu and Kashmir, that is the single most important factor that really shaped the destiny of millions of people, not just in Jammu and Kashmir, but the rest of the country also. Jammu and Kashmir's 370 was granted in a certain context. And the context, of course, was after the partition of India, in which two countries were created. One was, of course, Pakistan, and the other was India. And Jammu and Kashmir, because it was a Muslim majority state, and the circumstances in which it became a part of India somehow got complicated, because Pakistan tried to invade Jammu and Kashmir state, which was a princely state before 1947. And Jammu and Kashmir's ruler at the time, Maharaja Hari Singh, he acceded, of course, looking for help when Pakistan tried to invade the state. And in those circumstances, Jammu and Kashmir became part of India. Now, apart from that, Article 370 was granted to Jammu and Kashmir under the Constitution of India. But even at that time, there was a lot of opposition to the whole idea of 370, which essentially meant granting special status to Jammu and Kashmir state, which was very unique, which was very different from the rest of India, where everybody was at par, where every constituent, every state was at par with each other. And at that point of time, BJP, which was at that time it's still in the nascent years of its formation, they opposed the whole idea, because in no secular democratic dispensation can a state have different status, especially if it's a secular democratic republic. It could not have that, you have two different constitutions, two different laws, two different systems of governance. So from that perspective, it was Jammu and Kashmir was different, and Article 370 sowed seeds of political discontentment, political opposition at the very beginning of the formation of this country, and also Jammu and Kashmir, which became part of India. Now, 370, more than anything else, I would say it created a psychological barrier between the people of Jammu and Kashmir and the rest of India. Apart from what Pakistan did starting from 1947, it made 4 attempts to invade Jammu and Kashmir, and then of course in the last 30 years it has been perpetrating cross-border terrorism in the state. It killed thousands and thousands of Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims in the state to annex it. So the question here is that how did Article 370 create a psychological barrier between J&K and the rest of India? Because Jammu and Kashmir was seen as the special status, seen as different from the rest of the country, the politicians in Jammu and Kashmir basically sold the idea that Jammu and Kashmir, because it was a Muslim majority state, and by the principle of two nation theory under which Pakistan was created, Jammu and Kashmir should have gone to Pakistan. And since it did not go to Pakistan and it became part of India, Jammu and Kashmir's Muslim leadership, which was concentrated in Kashmir, they projected as if they had done a huge favor to India. So they used Article 370 as a blackmailing tool. So whenever there was an issue of say power, or when they wanted funds, when they wanted New Delhi to do things that would help them to stay in power, they used Article 370 as a blackmailing tool. And in that process, Kashmiri people started believing that Article 370 was essential for its existence. The Kashmiri mainstream politician basically told his constituents in Kashmir that since you are Muslims and India is the Hindu majority nation, your Islam is in danger, your identity is in danger, your whole existence is in danger. And that created a gulf between communities, that created a gulf between New Delhi and Kashmir, that created a gulf between the rest of India and Kashmir. So essentially, if you really ask me in one line, what did Article 370 do to Jammu and Kashmir in the last 70 years? I would say that it perpetuated the idea of two-nation theory. It perpetuated the idea of Pakistan, even though India was a secular democratic republic, even though it is a secular democratic republic. It perpetuated the idea that a Muslim majority state cannot live as an equal and at par with the rest of India. So I would say in the last 1 year, I think that confusion is over, that ambiguity is over, that Jammu and Kashmir is special because it's Muslim majority. The whole idea of communalism, which Article 370 generated and perpetuated, it's over. As of today, under the new scheme of things, where Article 370 has been nullified because of the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir state, which happened on August 5th, 2019, last year. Today, Jammu and Kashmir state has the same rights, same system as the rest of India. It does not have a separate constitution. It does not have a separate law. It does not have a separate flag. It has the same system as the rest of India. What has happened to Jammu and Kashmir on the ground is a different story. In the last 30 years, what the nullification of 370 will do or has done in last 1 year, again, is a different story. It's far more complex than people think. Because if an entire society has been fed a communal perspective for 70 years, and in the last 30 years, an entire society has believed that there will be some kind of resolution between India and Pakistan, and there will be some kind of give and take between New Delhi and Srinagar. That has not happened. What has really happened is that India, as a secular democratic republic, has prevailed in Jammu and Kashmir in the way it should have, beginning 1947 or beginning 1950, when India became a republic. So from that perspective, I would say that many people may be disgruntled in Kashmir, because for a long time they thought that they had the special status, and they were privileged, and they had this special position or special bargaining chip, which they now don't have. So it is going to take them time to come to terms with that new system and new dispensation. And also they will have to get used to the idea that they are like the rest of the citizens of India. They will have to go through the same process and same mechanisms as anybody else. They will not be given any incentives greater than, say, citizens of Punjab or Haryana or any other state.
Thank you, Aarti. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. I think in many ways it sort of ends ambiguity in many ways, like you have pointed out. Thank you for that. So, staying on Article 370, the article also had very regressive provisions when it comes to the rights of women, when it comes to rights of refugees who had migrated during the partition, as well as a lot of Dalits. So can you tell us about that? What was it like for different social groups under this particular article?
Yes, well, because of the partition, there was a massive migration between India and Pakistan in 1947. And a massive number of people came to Jammu and Kashmir as well, whom we called West Pakistan refugees. They, however, did not get any citizenship rights or any state subject rights under the new government or the new dispensation Jammu and Kashmir got after the princely state basically got converted into a proper state under the Constitution of India and became part of India. Now, why did that happen? That happened because Jammu and Kashmir had its own constitution. Jammu and Kashmir had its own permanent residency laws. And according to those permanent residency laws, only the native people of Jammu and Kashmir who were natives under the Dogra rule became the state subjects of Jammu and Kashmir under its own constitution. And unfortunately, the Constitution of India recognized Jammu and Kashmir's right to do so under Article 35A in the Constitution of India. So, which meant that if there were refugees who had come in 1947 and they were living in Jammu and Kashmir as refugees, as West Pakistan refugees, they had absolutely no rights as citizens or state subjects of Jammu and Kashmir. It also meant that, a large number of Valmiki community, Valmikis are essentially Dalits, who were brought from Punjab and nearby states to Jammu and Kashmir for menial jobs like, a sweeper class and for other municipality work. And they remained also outside, not even the margins, but outside the margins of society, because they did not get any state subject rights in J&K under the permanent residency laws of Jammu and Kashmir. Then, of course, there was another category of women who were married, who married outside the state, for example, until 2001-2002. Women, if they married outsiders, which meant if they married non-state subjects, were disqualified as citizens of Jammu and Kashmir under its permanent residency laws. I, of course, married in 2005, and 2000 by 2001, 2002, the High Court of Jammu and Kashmir, after a long legal battle, had slightly reversed this whole regressive law of Jammu and Kashmir, which disqualified women if they were married to non-state subjects. But there was a certain disclaimer to that. Anybody who had, any woman who had married outside the state, their children could not inherit any citizenship rights. They could not inherit any land or property of their parents. They could not pursue higher education in Jammu and Kashmir, which meant that my siblings who had, my female cousins who had married outside the state, their children could not inherit any state subject rights in the state. So that discrimination had continued even after 2002, and that has been reversed after the nullification of 35A, which is connected to the permanent residency laws, which was connected to that. That again has been reversed because now both 35A and 370 were nullified when the state was reorganized last year, bifurcated into two union territories, and Jammu and Kashmir became one union territory and Ladakh became another union territory. And all the domicile idea or the domicile laws that Jammu and Kashmir had been granted under the Dogra rules, they were nullified too. So one important thing that the central government did in the last 1 year after the nullification of 35A and 370 was issuance of domicile certificate not only to the natives of Jammu and Kashmir, but also to West Pakistan refugees, but also to the Valmiki community, the Dalits, and also to the children and children of the women who had married outside the state, and also, of course, women who had married outside the state long ago. So that discrimination has ended, that injustice has ended, that illiberalism has ended finally. So I would say that with that, and of course one more thing happened, that the new domicile law in Jammu and Kashmir has also extended citizenship or native land, not land, but native rights to education and employment to people who have served in Jammu and Kashmir for at least 15 years, and people who have studied there to a certain class. So there are many other things that have happened to people who have really spent time and devoted their life to the state. Another thing that the government did in the recent past was issuing a notification on land laws. So now the land of Jammu and Kashmir is open to the rest of India, which means the citizens of rest of India can go and buy land there, can settle down there, as Kashmiri people or Jammu and Kashmir people have been enjoying that right in the rest of India. In every small pocket of India, if you really see, in any urban pocket, you will see a little Kashmir has been established through traders, through Kashmiri Muslim population, or even Kashmiri Pandit population that migrated in the last 30 years because of cross-border terrorism in Kashmir. So I think a lot of progressive changes have happened, and it is going to create a far better and far more advanced and progressive, pluralistic, and I would say also diverse society in Jammu and Kashmir, especially in Kashmir, which had become homogenous after 1990 because of terrorism.
Absolutely, Aarti, and I think it's therefore sort of goes to show why people say that it's sort of a historical wrong which has been corrected in some ways. Thank you for sharing those insights. When especially the world talks about Kashmir, um, the discussions always tend to ignore the Kashmiri Pandits. Or at best, Kashmiri Pandits become like a footnote in the larger discussion. Do you think that it's high time, especially the world, outside India, sort of recognizes the struggles of Kashmiri Pandit community? A very little awareness is there about this issue, but do you think it's high time the world really pays attention to what happened with this community?
Undoubtedly, the world should pay attention to the fact that an entire indigenous minority of Kashmir, who have 5,000 years of recorded history as natives in Kashmir, they were driven out, they were subjected to genocide in 1990 by Islamist terrorists of JKLF, of Hizbul Mujahideen, and other terror outfits which were sponsored by Pakistan. But more than that, I would say, Kamal, that the fact is that Indian state has miserably failed in projecting this fact worldwide in the last 30 years. Kashmiri Pandits on their own have tried very hard to tell their story, to reach out to the world, to pay, to to bring some attention to their misery and to their suffering. But you will hardly see any literature in the international press. You will hardly see any documentaries made by the US, the UK media, or European media. In fact, the entire Western media completely neglected this story because, as I have been saying several times, that the Western media looks at Kashmir from their own political interests, from their own prism, which is clouded and which is colored by the interests of various geopolitical players. So I would say that, I don't have an expectation that the Western press is going to turn around and pay attention to Kashmiri Pandit genocide, because their perspective about Kashmir is hugely influenced by the Pakistan story, because Pakistan until recently was a client of the US. It was also seen as an ally of the US rather than India as an ally of the US. So the Western press went by its own prejudices and biases against Kashmiri Pandit genocide. Just imagine if Rwandan genocide had been given that same treatment, you would have not heard anything about it. Imagine if Jewish Holocaust was neglected by the Western media. We would not have known the kind of atrocities that were committed by the Nazis in before in the time period up to the Second World War. So I would say that the problem is not only that the Western media has neglected this story. The problem is also that Kashmir is at the center of a huge geopolitical game where a lot of players are involved, and you cannot expect them to pay attention to Kashmiri Pandit genocide. But I would say that it's India that needs to pay attention to this story, because India itself neglected it. If you really look at Indian media, really, I mean, you look at the archives of 1990, whether it was television and also the print media, you won't find mention of ethnic cleansing or genocide of Kashmiri Pandits in 1990. You will hardly read any commentary or opinion pieces or any outcry or outrage by the intelligentsia and intellectuals of India, who remained completely silent over it, because they feared that if they spoke about the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus, it would empower and it would galvanize the Hindu right wing in the rest of India, and it will basically bring them to power. So with that calculation, not only did the West neglect this story, but also the Indian media. So I have been thoroughly disillusioned and disappointed with the global players and with Indian intelligentsia and intellectuals, that I don't expect that many people will pay attention to this story.
Absolutely, Aartiji. And I think there is a lot that we in India also have to be doing, be it the media, be it the Indian state, like you said, in order to actually live up to our responsibility of telling what this very important story, what happened. I want to come to what you raised about the role of external players in just a bit. But before I do that, I wanted to focus on the governance of Jammu and Kashmir. When we look at that, despite a large, amounts of budgets and schemes being allocated to the now the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, a lot of it doesn't actually translate on the ground into the impact, the kind of impact that one would want to see. Does Jammu and Kashmir have a governance problem? Has it had a governance problem historically? And what could be the ways for this? What could be the reasons for this?
Okay, so if you really go to Srinagar, which is the summer capital of Jammu and Kashmir, continues to be the summer capital. If you go to Srinagar, you will be shocked because Srinagar does not give you any signs of conflict in Kashmir. It doesn't tell you that this is a war ravaged or a conflict torn place. Or in fact, it will give you the opposite sense. You will assume that this is a very wealthy and a very prosperous place, because in the last 30 years lot of funding went to Jammu and Kashmir under security expenditure, under development expenditure, under basically 90% of funding of Jammu and Kashmir came from the center for various purposes, but it was concentrated in the hands of few, and you can see that in some urban pockets of Kashmir, essentially wherever the elite has been living in the last 30 years. But the moment you step out of urban Srinagar, urban towns of Kashmir, you will notice that the development, the poverty levels are as bad as the rest of this country. So essentially what I'm saying is that governance and development were hit, of course, because conflict became an industry in Jammu and Kashmir. I have talked about it several times that there's a certain economics of conflict. It suited vested interests in Jammu and Kashmir to perpetuate the conflict. It suited them because every lot of people were minting money out of New Delhi and also out of Pakistan, because Pakistan at the end of the day was functioning as an invisible state in Kashmir. It was functioning because it really invested in massive numbers of assets in Kashmir. It created a huge network of ISI agents. It created a huge network of militants and terrorists in Kashmir. So, money was coming both from Pakistan and from India, and a lot of people thought that it was beneficial to continue this conflict, to continue the killings, and a lot of people would be disheartened and disappointed that in the last 1 year that graph has gone down tremendously. The graph of violence of civilians has come down tremendously. So what I'm saying is that governance and development, of course, are tied to the conflict and the kind of money that was coming in. But I can now predict that as the conflict is sort of I shouldn't say that cross-border terrorism is going to end soon, or Pakistan is going to change its behavior or strategy towards India. Pakistani army's existence is dependent on conflict in Kashmir. Its existence is dependent on destabilizing India. So that part may not change easily. But what has changed in the last 1 year is that a lot of money which was being given or which was being used to perpetuate that conflict is now finally going to development activities. But I would say that in the last 1 year, unfortunately, bureaucracy is yet to show that it can deliver as in the new current system. It hasn't delivered yet, at least on the fronts of development. One can argue that initially there was a lockdown because militants imposed lockdown after the reorganization of the state. One can also argue that there has been coronavirus pandemic and there was another lockdown because of that, and therefore there has been a disruption almost of over a year and a half. But even then, I would say a lot many things could have happened, because I did go to Ladakh and I saw that despite the lockdown, a lot of work is really happening. Ladakh is on a different trajectory, and I'm very hopeful about its development. I'm not so sure about Jammu and Kashmir, because I don't think the bureaucracy of Jammu and Kashmir has delivered on the development front. I think the security establishment has delivered. The security of Jammu and Kashmir, I would say, has done a marvelous job. We did not see any agitations. We did not see any bloodbath as many had predicted. In fact, mainstream politicians of Jammu and Kashmir had predicted that a lot of people will get killed if Article 370 was nullified or abrogated. That did not happen. A lot of people, a lot of cynics, a lot of intellectuals in New Delhi and other parts of India had predicted that Kashmir will burn and the rest of the country will burn if Article 370 was removed. None of that happened. So that really tells us that the security establishment has done an outstanding job, and they must get that credit completely. I think your question about development. So I would say, in very briefly, I would say that except for a few pockets in Kashmir, most of the regions of Jammu and Kashmir have remained underdeveloped. In fact, Jammu region has been really neglected. Ladakh was highly discriminated against by the Kashmiri leadership in the last 70 years. If you go to the upper reaches of Jammu region, Rajouri, Poonch, Doda, Bhaderwa, Kishtwar, you will see that nothing has really has been done by the Kashmiri leadership for people other than Kashmiri community, and that too Kashmiri Muslim community, because Kashmiri Pandits were driven out, they were slaughtered, and they were not asked to come back. And even if they were asked to come back, there was no movement or there was no plan for the return and rehabilitation of Kashmiri Pandits. So if you really look at the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir, I mean Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir today and the Union Territory of Ladakh separately, you will notice large chunks of both the Union Territories have hardly seen any development in the last 70 years.
Right. I think that was a very comprehensive account of governance and the challenges, particularly that I think some of which I think continue in Jammu and Kashmir. So I wanted to look at some of the current recent developments. We have had, I think, 7 phases of DDC polls that have been conducted so far. So I was wondering, how do you look at these developments, and is there a possibility for Jammu and Kashmir to have a fresh start in a way, especially in terms of the possibility of a kind of a grassroots leadership sort of emerging in this particular scenario? How do you look at that?
I think one has to give credit to this government in the center, that they are trying to provide a fresh start to Jammu and Kashmir. because a lot has happened in the last 70 years. 4 conventional wars with Pakistan, 30 years of proxy war with Pakistan, which meant, ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Pandits, which also meant around 20,000 Kashmiri Muslims who were slaughtered by Pakistani terrorists in Kashmir. A lot has happened. And the kind of politics that the mainstream politicians in Kashmir played, it's been really regressive, it's been illiberal, it's been communal. It's been really communal in the kind of politics that they have played in the last 30 years. There was one strand, of course, was soft separatism, the other was hard separatism, and in between there was other kinds of separatism, but it was separatism in one form or the other. So from that point to this point that we now have DDC elections going on, we earlier had panchayat elections in Jammu and Kashmir, and for that the credit must go to this government, that they are trying to build an organic democratic system in Kashmir, in Jammu and Kashmir. You see, for the longest time, the separatists in Kashmir have been complaining that there was no democracy in Jammu and Kashmir. It was all imposed by the central government. In the last 70 years, whatever elections were run in Jammu and Kashmir, some got tainted as rigged elections, for example, in 1987, and some were seen as were not seen as credible elections. So for the first time, there is panchayat elections, which means grassroots level democracy. DDC elections, again, grassroots level of democracy. So in a way, you are empowering common man in Jammu and Kashmir. You are bypassing, you are surpassing all these people who had blackmailed New Delhi in the last 70 years using Article 370 to stay in power, to do corruption, to sit and make money, and to mint money on the dead bodies of Jammu and Kashmir. A lot of people got killed, but who got them killed? These are the people who got them killed because they sold this fantasy that there could be autonomy, that there could be azadi, which was separatism, that there could be self-rule. They sold different, different products, of course, sugar coated hugely, but all of them were essentially separatist models which were sold in different ways. And that has ended now. That is not going to come back. And people do understand this in Jammu and Kashmir today. People in Kashmir, maybe they were disheartened, disappointed, and disillusioned last year. But I think a lot of them, because if you go by the numbers, the number of people who did come out to vote in Jammu and Kashmir in the recent elections, one can tell that they are showing they're showing faith in Indian democracy. They are showing faith in the new setup, the new system that has been established. So I would say that yes, the government of India is trying to give Jammu and Kashmir a new start, but at the same time, I would say that with a bit of caution, because the Gupkar Alliance, for example, all these mainstream politicians who stayed in power, who minted money, who have been accused of corruption in J&K, they all came together and they created this Gupkar Alliance. And they created this alliance over the basic demand of restoration of Article 370 and restoration of statehood. And they, even though they themselves are not at the forefront of these elections, but many of their proxy candidates did participate in these elections. So that kind of, I would say that, if they are coming back and they are getting elected, if they are getting elected, we'll see. We don't know yet. But if they are participating in these elections and if they are coming back into the system, I'm not sure it will be a completely new start. It will be, I think you can call it a hybrid start, where you have some elements from the old system and some elements from the new system. And I would say it still is a better option than having this entire old system back in place with the same mechanisms that they used for the last 70 years.
Right. And I think that vicious cycle really needs to be broken. And I think you've laid it out very beautifully. So when we talk about progress in Jammu and Kashmir, it is an anathema to Pakistan, and which has pushed its agenda of terrorism, of radicalization for many decades now. So, what is the kind of role Pakistan has played historically in sort of bringing Jammu and Kashmir to the kind of challenges that it has, and also with the kind of changes that we are seeing now, where does that sort of leave Pakistan, and what would it try to do now?
Okay, so if you remember when Pakistan sponsored cross-border terrorism erupted in Kashmir, they attacked the various terror outfits like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taiba. They attacked every single institution of the state, including schools, including colleges, and including universities. And that is why in the year 1990, everything got disrupted, everything broke down, the state collapsed in Kashmir in 1990. And New Delhi had absolutely no idea how to keep the state intact in Jammu and Kashmir. From that point onwards, I think at least till 1996, Jammu and Kashmir was continually under attack in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of cinema, entertainment. The terror outfits attacked, for example, cinemas, and it's been 30 years. It's taken 30 years to restart cinemas in Kashmir. There were attacks by terror groups against not just Kashmiri Pandits, but also Kashmiri Muslims. There were terror outfits which issued diktats like dress codes for Kashmiri Muslim women. Women were forced to wear hijab. Women were forced not to wear jeans. Women were forced to wear veil. There was this brigade of women terrorists called Duktarane Millat, which was run by Asya Andrabi. And she enforced that dress code in Kashmiri society. And where was this coming from? All these diktats were coming straight from Pakistan, because Pakistan mobilized Kashmiri Muslim youth, Kashmiri Muslim society against India in the name of Islam. Lot of terrorists would go to masjids and they would make announcements against Kashmiri Pandits. They would make announcements which ruptured the entire society, which broke down the entire fabric of Kashmiri society. The kind of gulf that we continue to see between Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims, it was affected by that terror movement which started in 89-90. So Pakistan's role has been enormously destructive, not only in terms of killing people in Jammu and Kashmir, but also destroying the very social fabric of Jammu and Kashmir. And also it's responsible also for pushing Kashmiri society, which was progressive, which had a tradition and a history and heritage of its own, which is like 5,000 years of documented history, where both Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims remembered their Buddhist heritage, they remembered their Hindu heritage, they remembered their Shavist heritage, and it was celebrated, among various sections of society, in even among Kashmiri Muslims. So that has been destroyed. Apart from that, I would say that, uh, the fact that today there is massive radicalization in Kashmiri Muslim society, it is because Pakistan exported the ideology of Wahhabi Islam in Kashmir through terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. It is the Hizbul Mujahideen and Jamaat-e-Islami who basically brought in bigotry, and who brought in the communal nature of politics and communal nature of violence in Kashmir, which we did not, at least in my childhood, I did not witness it for some time. So I would say that, Pakistan's role has not only been in being destructive towards the infrastructure in J&K, but also in terms of emotional destruction, also in terms of social destruction, also I would say economic destruction for people who were not in the elite and upper class. The upper class figured out the way to make money. A lot of people who were in power and politics, they became wealthier, they generated more money. A lot of criminals became wealthy, but a huge section of Jammu and Kashmir society really suffered on account of economy, on because a lot of Jammu and Kashmir's revenue was essentially tourism driven. Tourism was hit hugely, to the extent that people who were in tourism sector in Kashmir, they had to move out. That is why you see a little Kashmir established not only in Punjab or Haryana or Delhi, but also in places as far as Kochi, as far as Calcutta, as far as Hyderabad and Pune. So that has happened. So I would say that Pakistan is responsible for the economic destruction, the political destruction, the social destruction, the emotional destruction. And I think if given how Pakistan has behaved under the Imran Khan government, I don't see much change, and I don't expect any change under the Imran Khan government.
Absolutely. I think even after, I think creating the kind of destruction that it has, it still sort of wants to use this issue not just for its strategic and geopolitical sort of goals, but also even domestically, the way it has done in inside Pakistan. Uh, so I want to sort of move and look at the international perception of Kashmir. Now, last year you were part of the US congressional hearing, and you've written about how biased the forum was. So against India and against Indian interests, and the kind of narrow understanding a lot of people sort of had about Kashmir. So I wanted to understand how skewed and distorted are some of these discussions about Kashmir, be it in the US or be it in other places internationally.
Uh, if you remember last year, after that US congressional hearing, I came out and I did say that the entire hearing was a setup against India, and it was hugely manipulated by Pakistan against India. And as I said earlier during this conversation, that India itself has harmed its cause in Jammu and Kashmir. It ceded space to Pakistan in the last 30 years in Kashmir. Not only in Kashmir, but it allowed Pakistan to influence the global thinking and the global narrative on Kashmir. If you read any of the magazines, newspapers that come out of the Western media, you will see that it is the Pakistani position that they are peddling. It's the Pakistani narrative that they've been peddling. That is why India is seen as an occupier and as an evil oppressor in Kashmir, rather than Pakistan, which has killed not only Kashmiri Pandits, which has driven out the indigenous community of Kashmiri Pandits, but also killed over 20,000 Kashmiri Muslim civilians, targeted killings. I'm not talking about, encounter killings. Uh, I'm not talking about cross-firing killings. I'm not talking about many other killings that happened in the last 30 years in Kashmir. Targeted killings that Pakistani terror groups have committed in Kashmir. They killed Kashmiri Muslims. Kashmiri Muslim terrorists killed their own brothers. They killed their own fathers. They killed their own relatives and friends, because these people disagreed with their ideology. These people disagreed with their view of Kashmir and their politics. But if you look at the press in the West, if you look at the not just the press, but if you speak to intellectuals in the West, their notion about Kashmir, their perception about Kashmir is completely the Pakistani perspective and not the Indian perspective. So one has to question why. How is it that India, which really, pampered Jammu and Kashmir in the last 70 years, no other state in the Union of India got the kind of treatment Jammu and Kashmir got in terms of, say, funding. The kind of funding J&K received, there is no other state or union territory which got as many funds. There is no other union territory or state whose demands were met at the drop of a hat. Jammu and Kashmir was always given a special special seat on the table. That kind of pampering and that kind of, I would say, good behavior that Indian state showed in the last 70 years, it's really commendable. It's really, it shows the ethos and the philosophy of India, which is essentially being accommodating, being pluralistic, being open, and being respectful towards how people feel of diverse communities. I don't think, there is any other example in the entire world where just because you are a Muslim majority state, you would be granted that kind of status. There is no such example in the US. There is no such example in Europe. There is no such example in UK, where Muslims or where any community will get special treatment like that. So it's only in India where Jammu and Kashmir was getting respect and love and kindness and compassion, because we really believed, or we still believe, that we are one people. We have been one people. We are one civilization. And that's true also for people who are in Pakistan. It's one civilization. So how is it that the West has come to have a different understanding about Kashmir? It's because of the geopolitical equations of the region with the rest of the world. After 1947, India was seen as an ally of Soviet Union, and Pakistan was quick enough to ally with the US. And as a result, I would say that, US did not look at India favorably, because India was always as a suspect that India is going to promote the communist agenda and India will be the next communist colony in this region. So India was not seen favorably up till a long time. In fact, till economic liberalization happened, which happened in 1990. So when that happened, slowly geopolitics changed. But India was very, very slow in understanding Pakistan's game in Kashmir after having experienced Pakistan's game in Punjab, where they propped up Khalistanis, where they sponsored Khalistani terror. So I would really blame the Indian bureaucracy, the Indian state, for neglecting what Pakistan was doing to Jammu and Kashmir, for what Pakistan was doing in the rest of the world, and creating this false fake narrative about Kashmir that India is the oppressor and Pakistan is this righteous state, which is really peaceful, and it has nothing. Uh, it was, after all, an ally of the US in uh, throwing out Russia out of Afghanistan. So Pakistan was in a very good spot, except that September 11 happened, and that's when Pakistan got exposed. That's when Pakistan's support to terrorism. That's when the very fact that Pakistan is the epicenter of global terror became apparent to the world. Until that point, nobody in the world really believed believed what India was saying about Pakistan. But by that time, India had lost its narrative on Kashmir. India did not highlight the story of the genocide of Kashmiri Pandits. India did not highlight the story of massacre of Kashmiri Muslims committed by Kashmiri Muslim terrorists and Pakistani terrorists. So, whose responsibility was it? It was the responsibility of Indian intellectuals. It was the responsibility of Indian media. It was the responsibility of Indian politicians. But none of them showed any interest because the way Indian state was. And I would say it was a very weak state for a very long time. It was only, I think, Indian state has shown its mettle and strength only after the economic reforms that Narasimha Rao, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao brought. So I would say that the West will continue to play those games because now I want to bring in the historical players in the region. So many people think that Kashmir is only a post 1947 problem because Pakistan wanted Jammu and Kashmir because it's a Muslim majority state, and that is why Pakistan wanted it. But the story goes even further back in time. Jammu and Kashmir, of course, is a Muslim majority state, but it's not because it's a Muslim majority state that international players were interested in it. It's because Jammu and Kashmir's geographical location is very peculiar. It is at the heart and the center of several boundaries and different civilizations. On the left, you have the Chinese, not really Chinese, but Tibetans. But Tibet got occupied. Tibet was annexed by Chinese. And on the right side, on the so when I mean left, I meant on your east, you have Chinese, Tibetans occupied by Chinese, and on your west, you have Pakistan, and of course Afghanistan, and then the route to Central Asia. Before 1947, when the British were in control of this region as colonial rulers, the fear was that Russia, which was the but the biggest empire of its time, that Russia's influence was to be contained. That was the thinking of the British colonial rulers, and for that they saw Jammu and Kashmir as a buffer, because British were ruling India and they saw J&K as a buffer. And once the partition happened, Pakistan was created. They did not really trust Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, for him to really pursue their geopolitical goals and geopolitical interests. They did not see Nehru pursuing the anti-Soviet line in the region, because Nehru was ideologically and emotionally aligned and far more in tune with the Soviet Union, with the communists, with the Marxists than the capitalists, because India, at the end of the day, India had suffered colonial rule because of the East India Company's capitalism. They entered the Indian subcontinent through capital. I would say it was crony capitalism and neo capitalism. So they did not trust Nehru. Therefore, they created the dispute of Jammu and Kashmir way before anybody got to know that J&K was going to become a dispute. Now, one would say that how did it become a dispute? Well, it became a dispute because Pakistanis who tried to invade Jammu and Kashmir in 1947, they were helped by the British military officers in that invasion of Jammu and Kashmir. They captured Gilgit-Baltistan, they captured Pakistan-occupied Kashmir with the help of British military officers in the region, in Gilgit-Baltistan, in fact. So that's how this dispute has come into existence. And that is why the British line, that is why the European line, and that is why the NATO members line on Kashmir has been a line which is essentially aligned to the line of Pakistan rather than India, because it has a long history of geopolitical interests. We do know that Soviet Union does not exist today. USSR got disintegrated 30 years ago or so. But at the end of the day, we have to also take into account that Afghanistan remains a problem in the region. Pakistan remains a problem in the region, and not only for this region now, they are a problem for the rest of the world, especially the West. We also know that Chinese now are a huge threat, not only to India, but the rest of the world. Now we have entered into Cold War situation 2.0 between the US and China now. But with the new presidency in the US, we don't know how. I think under President Trump, we did see that Cold War 2.0 was accelerating, and we knew that in India was going to be a major player in that Cold War. We don't know how it is going to pan out under President Biden, but we do know that Kashmir will remain an interest, a geopolitical interest for various power players, because if you really look at what China has done in the region, it is gone and it's trying to build a China-Pakistan economic corridor, and it starts through the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. It is blocking India's access to which Pakistan had already, but we don't know how things will shape up. So China is blocking access of India to Central Asia and to Afghanistan. Earlier, Pakistan was. Now, not only that, but China's attempt to access the oceans, the Arabian Ocean, which is basically Indian Oceans on the west of Indian Ocean. So we know that China remains a power player, Pakistan remains a power player, but also the US and the rest of the world is also a power player in the region. So Kashmir is not going to get sorted out completely, because unless Kashmiris understand that they are sitting geographically at a very unique position, and they must stay out of it, they must shun violence, they must not be a part of this geopolitical game of world powers, I don't think it's going to be an easy thing for them.
Right. I think thank you for sort of laying out all of the different geopolitics around it. It's very fascinating, and I think a lot of geopolitics itself is undergoing a lot of churn, especially I think in this particular year. We have, of course, the geopolitics of around Kashmir, and we have the relationship between India and US and Pakistan and the US as well as China. But there is also this element, or there is this nexus between especially in the US. There's a left Islamist nexus, and you've written about this and how a lot of times a lot of lobbying done in places like the US actually you can trace that back to Pakistan. So can you tell us about that nexus that operates in the US?
I'm glad that you brought me back to the US congressional hearing. Uh, it was interesting to see that Ilhan Omar, who's a Democrat congressperson, congresswoman in the US, she came with a script to the US Congress hearing, and it was quite shocking for me because I had not anticipated or imagined that a US congresswoman who has no connection whatsoever to Kashmir, or at that point of time, I did not realize that she has a connection to Pakistan. But I did wonder that this congresswoman has had no connection with India or Kashmir, but she had come with a script targeting me and calling me a spokesperson of the government of India. And it's strange because my professional records, my professional standing, my entire career is a testimony to the fact that I've been a thorough, objective journalist. I have had no political affiliations whatsoever. But Ilhan Omar came and she read out a script targeting me, and she did not even allow me to respond to her accusations. And later, after I came back and I started investigating the whole affair, because it did seem, I mean, it was apparent to me that it was a setup, because senator after senator, not senator, sorry, Congress, another congresswoman, Pramila Jayapal, and other congress men and women who tried to censor me in the US congressional hearing. And I wanted to understand what had really happened. How was this setup done to target me, and why was I targeted? So I tried to, investigate, and I was fortunate to get a lot of information from public domain on the internet, and also from some sources in the US who had been working on Ilhan Omar and her connections in the US. And it turned out that she's been, of course, she works with America's CARE, and she works with a lot of Islamist organizations in the US, who are in turn connected to Jamaat-e Islami in Pakistan, who in turn are connected to terror organizations like Hizbul Mujahideen, like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed in one or the other way. And it was strange that these people who work for, directly or indirectly work for terror organizations which are banned, not just by India, but globally banned. These are the organizations which are banned by the United Nations. These are the organizations which are banned by the US themselves. And yet, these are the people who shamelessly work with these organizations, with these fronts which are being run by Pakistan's ISI and these terror groups in Pakistan. They are freely and fearlessly working in the US against the interests of India, working in favor of Pakistan, working in favor of Turkey and Qatar, who are also involved in funding of Kashmiri separatism as of today. So a lot of players, but if you really ask me briefly, what is this all about? It's simple. Kashmir has been a war between Islamists against India. So it's an Islamist war against India for the establishment of an Islamic state. So this mirage, this illusion that they can set up a caliphate, that they can set up Sharia law in Kashmir because they are mandated by their religion or mandated by their certain version of their religion, which I would say, Wahhabi or Deobandi Islam or the Jamaat-e Islami Islam. These are the versions of Islam which sort of mixed politics with life. And this war has continued for a very long time, and it will continue for we don't know how long. But one good thing that the Republic of India has done is it has removed constitutional confusions, constitutional ambiguity, and it has really completely integrated Jammu and Kashmir with the rest of India and brought it at par with the rest of India as it should have done in 1950 itself. So a big course correction, the biggest historical wrong that was committed in 1950 has been fixed by the nullification of 370 and 35A and by several measures that have been taken in the last 1 year.
Right. Aarti ji, I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of history, the geopolitics, the identity issues in Kashmir, as well as the governance issues in Kashmir. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on various questions that we have discussed. It's been very insightful. And I'm sure our audience has a lot to think about and to understand Kashmir in a very holistic sort of a manner. So thank you for sharing those insights.
Thank you, Kamal. Namaskar.
Namaste, Aarti ji.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.